All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us for this launch event of the release of the State of Climate Action 2022 report. This report is published under the System Change Lab. We think about the System Change Lab as a virtual situation room to design for action at pace and scale needed to limit global warming to 1.5 degree, halt biodiversity loss, and build a just economy. My name is Ani Dasgupta. I'm the President and CEO of World Resources Institute, and I'll be a moderator of today's event. But World Resources Institute, or WRI, is very pleased to co-host this event today, along with Bezos Earth Fund, Climate Action Tracker, which is a project of the Climate Analytics and the NewClimate Institute, ClimateWorks Foundation, the UN Climate Change high-level champions. And just want to say, for behalf of all these organizations, welcome. And we are very, very glad you've joined us. It's going to be a fascinating conversation today. The State of Climate Action 2023 report outlines a roadmap, that the world can follow to avoid increasingly dangerous and irreversible climate impacts while minimizing harm to biodiversity and food security. I think this report is really very different from any other report of this kind because it's not a list of commitments countries or businesses have made. It's actually an evaluation of actual action that's taking place in the economy, real changes that is happening in the economy. The report translates the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degree temperature limit into targets across sectors: power, buildings, industry, transport, forest, land, food and agriculture, technological carbon removal, and climate finance, and assesses the progress made towards these 2030 or 2050 goals on each of these sectors. How well are we doing? How far have we gone? As you'll hear in very great detail from the report's authors later, and we have a fantastic lineup of authors here. You'll hear the latest findings that reveal that in all sectors, and this most probably recent progress isn't happening at the pace and scale necessary to combat climate crisis. In fact, only one of the 42 indicators, which is share of electric passengers vehicle sales, one indicator is on track to reach the 2020 target. Although the findings of this report, and you can see the slide here, although the findings of the report show that collective effort to nearly halve GHG emission this decade, which is the goal for remaining within 1.5 degrees, are still failing woefully short. But it is possible to reverse this. And that is the beauty of this report. Probably reverse these worrying trends and accelerate change across on multiple fronts at the same time, as progress in one sector can spur gains in others. Let's take, for example, crop yields. Crop yields on existing farmland can help prevent agricultural expansion into forest and therefore play a critical role in reducing annual rate of deforestation. Or similarly, take decarbonization electricity generation, which underpins effort of GHG emission in buildings, industry, and cement. So this is exactly what the system change approach is, how the system works together and how we see the connection between different indicators. This is a very important year because of the global stocktake. This is the first year of the global stocktake under Paris Agreement that will culminate. The technical report is out. The political messaging on this, or agreement on this, will culminate in a few weeks in COP28, where world leaders must recognize the insufficient progress to date and chart a path towards that builds on the success in the sectors we're seeing and to move this forward. This moment, and I hope this report, will serve as a springboard for accelerated action to mitigate climate change, because climate crisis continues to intensify. Our future really depends on us and our leaders to move us forward. So that's the setup. I just want to introduce you. Can you put the slide of all our fantastic speakers there? So we have the plan for today is the following. As soon as I stop speaking, we're going to have my dear friend, Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, the CEO of and the president of Global Environment Facility, providing us a keynote address. After that, we'll have a panel of authors, Kelly Levin, the Chief of Science, Data, and Systems from Bezos Earth Fund, Louis Jeffrey from, sorry, I'm just going to see all my slides. Now I can see. From the NewClimate Institute, Sophie Moon from our own WRI, Claire Fison for the head of the climate policy team. I think I already made a mistake. Sorry, it's not Louis Jeffrey, it's Judith Heck, who is from the NewClimate Institute, is here, and I'm sorry about that. Following the presentation by authors in detail, we'll have a chance to have a conversation with a discussion with Wawa, Helen, and Carlos. I'll introduce them when we get to that. And finally, we'll have a chance to actually hear from your question, then we'll get the authors back in to actually answer your question. So that is the plan for today, and I hope you will find it as exciting as we think the report is. With that, Carlos, I would love to welcome you. Carlos, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Annie, and thanks to everyone joining us today. I'm super excited to be here at the launch of the State of Action 2023. I want to also congratulate the authors. I'm very happy to see so many young girls behind that report. That is really encouraging. And just, of course, my gratitude to the System Change Lab for the great work that they've been doing for us at the Jeff. Continued support of the System Change Lab is instrumental as we need to generate sound information for increased decision-making. This year, 2023, was especially hard on me as I was able to connect much better climate change into what do I do. I remember on the 5th of August, as I was getting out of my home in downtown Washington, D.C., heading to the Jeff office, and I saw the sky, and there was no sky. It was kind of haze all over the place with a funny smell in D.C., and I asked, what is going on? Have you seen the sky? And someone told me, don't you know about the forest fires in Canada? I said, what? Well, they explained me that there were forest fires in Canada, that, you know, the haze, the smoke was coming all the way down to Washington. And I was blown out by that. But, well, that was on the 5th of August. On the 22nd of August, I went to Vancouver, Canada, for the Jeff Assembly, and guess what? In Vancouver, the first day, I came out of the hotel, and the same thing. I was unable to see the sky. Everything was haze. Everything was weird. Smoke, smell of smoke all over the place. And I asked, what is going over here in Vancouver? And they told me, oh, the forest fires. A month later, first I saw the impact of the forest fires in Washington. A month later, the same large forest fires, like never seen in Canada, had the same impact in Vancouver. And I was really impressed by that. But also in July, I had the opportunity to go to see some Jeff projects in Morocco. And I spent a couple of days walking around, looking at projects with communities and protected areas in the Atlas Mountains. And the temperature was 42.5 degrees centigrade. And never in my life been in a place so hot. And let me tell you, if that is the new normality, if we don't get the 1.5, it's going to be very hard on many people. Yeah, that day I really connect the real impact of climate change, and I was really impressed. So I wanted to share these couple of anecdotes to mention that, yes, we do have a climate emergency. It is evident. Nevertheless, decision makers and governments continue to think and plan business as usual. I mean, just look at the report that the UNED put not long ago, where major economies, not just from the global north, but also from the global south, plan to double the investment to extract oil and gas. And that is a paradox, that is an irony, that is a high contradiction, because, you know, most of those countries are the large F recipient countries. They give us money to help developing countries implement the Paris Agreement at the same time that they are expanding big time on oil and gas. So my contribution today has a little to do with this. And I got 4 messages. And my first message has to do that beyond sector by sector trends, we need to know that there is not a single country in the world, global north, global south, that invests more in protecting nature than it spends on activities that destroy it. And this definitely has to change. Government, we know, should phase out subsidies, incentives, and policies that financially support carbon emission coming from all the different sectors. Once we do it, it is time to, implement the decarbonization plans, identify the climate adaptation needs, enhance climate resilience at the community level, and just, of course, align the full range of public and private investment with the Paris Agreement, which nobody is speaking today. Nobody is speaking today. How do we generate the political dialogues so we can expect a full range of public and private investment totally 100% aligned with the Paris Agreement? And unless and until we act to completely realign financial flows and reform negative subsidies, we will not be able to make a significant impact on slowing down climate change. That's what is needed to jumpstart the transitions we need to see in energy, and in particularly also in the agriculture land use sectors. So in terms of the system transformation, we are way behind where we should be, and the reports is very clear on this one. We're going, 1 mile an hour when we should be going 50 miles per hour. So one of the biggest errors we commit is that we don't use that much the scientific information as the baseline for the political discussions at the global level, and just, of course, and very importantly, at the national level. Conflicts of national interests, vested interests, rather than scientific reports, continue to manage the conversations and even the policy reforms agenda. And we need to put much more tools on the table. And this is why I'm particularly happy to be participating in the launch of this report, which works based on the findings and the research that the System Change Lab is doing. So there is, nevertheless, there is some positive momentum in environmental diplomacy that gives me some kind of hope. And I say that as a veteran of these negotiations, I continue to be optimistic. A year ago, for example, in Montreal, countries agreed to new frameworks of targets to protect nature. That agreement reached 1 year ago in Montreal is framed as a deal for biodiversity, but in reality, this is action that sets the right direction for the climate convention. So investing in nature is exactly how countries should respond to climate change. Both on one side to slow down the process of emissions and deforestation and ensure that our economies, particularly in the health diseases, are much more resilient to the worst of the impacts of climate change. My attention at COP28 is going to be on making sure that the global state talk gets the attention it needs, and that we are collectively focused on the change of direction, which is totally necessary. So I commend WRI for its work and welcome the 2023 State of Climate Action report as a clear description of what is needed to translate global goals into actions in specific sectors. It clearly shows the direction and speed of travel we need to take, and the clarity on this is extremely important. I must admit, I'm heading to Dubai with a heavy heart in some senses, particularly around the current state of financing fossil fuels and about the health of our forest. We are seeing that governments continue financing fossil fuels, providing large increased financial support through subsidies programs, which are on the rise on many of these countries. As I mentioned previously, a recent report from the UN indicates that food production is still going up, and we will never be able to achieve the 2030 goals. In the forest, an area very close to my heart, after my life work supporting restoration and forest conservation in Costa Rica, we are also seeing troubling trends. Deforestation actually increased in 2022 to nearly, 5-6 million hectares. And we already know how devastating the 2023 forest fires were. I have concerns about the boreal forest and about humid tropical forests, primary forests, which are also important for carbon sequestration. And I feel very frustrated that REDD+ hasn't been able to deliver what we planned 50 years ago. Unless we pay owners of forests, indigenous communities, countries for the valuable upside in carbon services, which is at least the cost of opportunity of doing carbon ranching, we will never make it. Today, the price of forest carbon for developing countries goes within $5 to $10, is way below the cost of opportunity of doing carbon ranching, and unless we level the economic playing field, forests will continue to disappear. So there is an area that I feel upbeat about. However, I look ahead to Dubai, and that is the young people who will be active, very active over there in the COP, and we're making such an enormous, energizing difference in the way we're all thinking about actions. Based on what I just mentioned, my experience in seeing forests, the impact of forest fires in Washington, and a month later in Vancouver, I began to thought that the Jeff model is not fit for the triple planetary crisis. That is why we're going to present a very ambitious new way of doing business for the Jeff in the next Reclaim Plan. And that new approach, which will be a whole of a government approach, whole of a society approach, where Jeff provide funding beyond one agency in the executive branch, with the Jeff working at national congresses, with the Jeff working at the sub-national level, going directly at the sub-national level, governors or mayors, but also very importantly, civil society, in particular groups associated to youth, indigenous communities, local communities, and women will be in the center of what the Jeff should aim in this whole of a government, whole of approach that Jeff 9 will be part of. So I want to thank you once more for the opportunity to be here and share some thought about this report and the political context. We need to keep on providing good, reliable, sound data. And my congratulations, Annie, to you and your team for the fabulous work that you have put together. Great timing, great products. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carlos. Carlos, the point you made about the whole economy approach, it's the transformation we need in the whole economy, and you hear that, but also how to translate the evidence, the data, to political action, which is, I think, the biggest challenge we're facing, and which we'll see in a few weeks. So I really like that you highlighted that, and that is. And everyone who have joined, if you don't know Carlos, I encourage you to get to know. He's an absolutely transformational leader. And he was a very successful politician in Costa Rica of environment, energy. He brought the payment for ecosystem as a mainstream to make it mainstream. But also Carlos has been an absolutely phenomenal leader for JAP. And at this moment, there is so much question about multilateral action. He has actually brought faith back to multilateral action. So Carlos, thank you for being here. You will hear from Carlos in a minute when we come back to you. So Carlos, stay with us. I just want to quickly move on to our fantastic set of authors and bring them here so they can share the key finding of the report. I also want to encourage all of you who have joined, if you have questions, please start dropping that in the link there so that our team can be ready to answer them. With that, I really want to welcome Kelly Levin, whom we very much like at WRI, that she's here. Kelly, over to you. And Kelly will introduce the other author as she goes along. Kelly, over to you.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Annie, and thanks so much, Carlos Manuel. So we're going to get into the findings of the report. As Annie said, basically we put forward, and we also tracked progress towards 1.5 aligned targets, and we designed 42 indicators across about 85% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And these range from everything from phasing out coal and electricity generation to decarbonizing steel to halting peatland degradation to phasing out public financing for fossil fuels. If you go to the next slide, please. So then what we did is we wanted to quantify the global gap in action across each one of these sectors. So we looked at recent rates of change versus what would needed to be achieved for the 2030 targets. And we then accordingly categorized the indicators as on track or off track or well off track or headed in the wrong direction. And some of them just didn't have enough data. So you'll see that with the colors here. And for those indicators that were heading in the right direction, but too slowly, we also identified how much current efforts would have to accelerate over this decade to meet the 2030 targets. And you'll see these little arrows with numbers, meaning they're kind of like acceleration factors. You would have to 10x it or 4x it or what have you. I should note that we did take into account in our methods nonlinear change, because we know historically technology adoption has often followed kind of more of an S-curve shape than a straight line. But as you can see, despite decades of dire warnings and wake-up calls, we're basically lagging behind on nearly every measure. And as Ani said, across the 42 indicators we assessed, just one was on track. From what you can see on this slide, the bad news is that nearly half of the indicators remain well off track, and that's the orange. So that means that they must accelerate at least twofold. And worse yet, in the red, you can see there are some indicators that are actually heading in the wrong direction altogether. And within this set of laggards, efforts, for example, to end public financing for fossil fuels, for halting deforestation, for expanding carbon pricing systems, experienced actually the most significant setbacks in a single year relative to recent trends. The good news is, though, there are some bright spots, and my co-authors are going to talk about that. So, for example, since 2020, the share of electric vehicles and passenger car sales has more than tripled. And for these yellow indicators that are moving at an insufficient but very promising speed, with the right support, some could take off. And we did see some indicators when you compared them to past years. They actually had some of the most significant gains in a single year relative to recent changes. And that includes, for example, increasing mandatory corporate climate risk disclosures, sales of electric trucks, and adoption of electric passenger cars. So those are some really promising signs, and we'll get into more detail there. If you go to the next slide, please. Just to underscore the scale of transformation that's required. This kind of translates what you saw in the previous slide into what needs to happen on the ground. So, for example, we need to phase out coal in electricity generation 7 times faster. We need to expand public transportation systems 6 times faster, and that means to cities collectively adding about 1,300 kilometers of metro rails, light rail, train tracks, and bus lanes per year through this decade. We need to reduce the annual rate of deforestation, which at the moment is equivalent to deforesting 15 football fields per minute in 2022. And we need to bring that down 4 times faster. And we need to, for example, shift to healthier and more sustainable diets 8 times faster in high consuming regions. So this is a tremendous task ahead, but it is doable. And we're seeing jurisdictions that are showing how it can get done. And we'll talk about some of those during the webinar. So let me hand it back over to you, Ani.
Kelly, it's you don't need to hand it back to me.
We'll now start to deep dive quickly into each of the sectors, and I will start by walking you through our analysis of the energy and use sectors, which are buildings, industry, and transport. So in our buildings analysis, what we look at are the emissions that are derived from the energy that is, on the one hand, used to keep our buildings comfortable, and on the other hand, which is used to power the activities that happen in the buildings, which include cooking, lighting, appliance use, and also heating and cooling. In building sector, around 2/3 of all the emissions actually do come from the generation of electricity that is used for these activities, and the remaining third is from direct burning of fossil fuels, mainly then from space and water heating as well as cooking. Especially this remaining third that now comes from direct burning those emissions could be avoided through electrification. Tracking change in the building sector is super challenging, mainly due to data availability and due to the global inconsistencies of the building stock. We were only able to track to categorize 2 out of our 4 indicators. Those are the energy used as well as the emissions produced per square meter of floor area. And both of these metrics are heading into the right direction, but much too slowly, where an acceleration of a 3-fold acceleration for the energy intensity and a 4-fold for the carbon intensity would be needed. So significant improvements are necessary there. As with everything that we show in this report, there is no one-size-fits-all solution. That's kind of one of our messages, right? That we have so many different things to tackle at the same time. But electrification is one of the key areas to decarbonize those end-use sectors that I'm presenting here. And here we have an example for heat pumps, which can be extremely effective in decarbonizing the heating system in buildings. And we can see here that between 2021 and 2022, there has been a massive surge of installations. Some countries have grown their heat pump stock by over 100% in just 1 year. And although this is all mainly in Europe, it is still a super promising sign to see how quickly change can happen. In order to get building sector on track, though, we also will need to drastically increase retrofitting rates. This is mainly retrofitting rates, which is currently less than 1% a year. They need to be between 2.5% and 3.5% per year. And also for new buildings, it is very important now to ensure that they are already energy efficient and do not rely on fossil fuels when they are being built. And this is extremely important because in large regions of the world, there is the major share of the future building stock is not even built yet. Which implies that now is the time to avoid future lock-ins. And this can be done by switching to the use of different materials, but also by decarbonizing the production of the materials that are currently already in use, which is steel and cement. And this brings me to the industry sector, where steel and cement together account for more than half of direct greenhouse gas emissions. That's why we also have a special emphasis on these 2 sectors, because decarbonizing those will have a massive impact on the sector as a whole. The amount of carbon that is currently emitted by per ton of cement produced and would need to increase more than 10 times faster. It's extremely off track. And related to that, and actually even more worryingly, here on the right-hand side, you can see that the recent trends in steel are even going into the wrong direction entirely. Other industrial processes that don't rely on such high temperature heat, so those that rely on lower temperature heat, they can be more easily decarbonized through electrification. And for that, we also have an indicator here where we can see that progress is happening at a slightly more promising pace, but still even there, a 4-fold acceleration is needed. So while none of the indicators are on track, there are still some positive recent developments. In the last couple of years, investments have increased and new supportive policies have been announced. And as we can see here in this figure, also the number of planned low carbon steel projects continues to rise. Although there is a bit of an imbalance here, that you can see that these projects are mainly in Europe, whereas the increase in demand for steel is happening increasingly in developing and emerging economies. These little bright spots, they're coming up, but they have not yet translated into the emission reduction that we actually need. But it's still good to see that these first steps are being done, because we need those first steps in order to eventually bend the curve. And it's also great that this demonstrates that some of the technical challenges in decarbonizing the industry sector are already being met, and that workable solutions are also coming into the market. So the transport sector, as already mentioned quickly, is the one where we have the brightest spot of the entire report, because this is the one indicator that is actually on track, and that is the share of battery electric vehicles in the sale of passenger cars. In the last couple of years, electric vehicles have become much cheaper, the ranges have improved, charging infrastructure has been built out, and this all led to substantial increases in the shares of renewables of electric vehicles in the sales of private cars. We're now reached 10%, and we are on track to possibly actually meet those 75 to 95% that will be necessary by 2030. Other positive signs are also being seen with electric 2- and 3-wheelers. They are growing at a promising rate, especially inside China and India. But if those sales patterns would be translated also into other regions that are heavily rely on these modes of transport, then also this 85% target could potentially be met. When we look at longer haul transport, which includes trucking, shipping, and also aviation, so the decarbonization of these modes of transport has been proven much more difficult, which is partly due to the fact that these technologies are just much more novel, meaning that there's still substantial investment required for research and development and deployment. And this is also the reason why these two indicators that we track here on shipping and aviation fuels remain extremely low. In shipping, there is a bit of a bright spot too. The International Maritime Organization countries have recently agreed that they would, for a new strategy that would aim to cut emissions in the sector by 20 to 30% by 2030. Despite these indicators that I just presented that shift from a more fossil fuel or internal combustion engine to a electric drivetrain or a more sustainable fuels, in order to actually decarbonize the sector, more transformational change is also needed here, which means we need also a change in the modes of transport. So what we track here is also the private vehicle use, and these passenger kilometers are still increasing, which is in the wrong direction where we should be going. And then there's also the modal share, so moving from motorized individual transport to more non-motorized and public transport. And to build out those infrastructures, we have indicators here that look at rapid transit networks and bike lanes, and also both of them are well off track. So basically across all of the end use sectors, we can see it's small examples everywhere that rapid change is possible, and they give us hope, but this is just not happening fast enough to actually meet the Paris Agreement goals. And what we also saw throughout these sectors is that electrification is a key measure to decarbonize them. And electrification, of course, is much more effective when the power supply is of zero carbon electricity, which is why I now hand over to my colleague Claire, who will tell you more about recent progress in the power sector.
Super. Thank you very much, Judith. So for the power sector, renewables really stand out as the success story. The share of solar and wind in particular has shot up on average 14% per year over the last 5 years. That is incredibly fast, but it does need to speed up to a 24% growth each year to reach our 2030 target. So we still have a way to go here, but momentum is building, and you can see that in the renewables indicator is yellow on track. But what I can't stress enough is that renewables only bring emissions down if they replace fossil fuel use. Unfortunately, we find that we are way off track in our move away from fossil fuel power, and that you see in the orange indicators. So in coal, we need to cut the share of coal in power generation 7 times faster than recent rates. There are currently over 500 gigawatts of new coal-fired power stations in the pipeline, mostly in developing countries. And if built, these countries would likely be saddled with stranded assets, as plants will need to be retired early to phase out coal globally by 2040. We also find that fossil gas cannot be used as a transition fuel. Gas needs to exit the power system very soon after coal, with only a 1% share remaining by 2040. And that means we need to cut its share 10 times faster than current rates. The developed world accounts for actually around 3/4 of global gas power, and so that must lead the charge on phasing out gas. But we are seeing a worrying gas pipeline of over 1,000 plants, half of which are in Asia, a region which has enormous potential to gain from the energy transition. Overall, our electricity is gradually getting cleaner. You can see that on the very far right. But as demand goes up, so do emissions. Last year, emissions from electricity hit a record high, and that's not a record that we want to break again. The good news, however, is that power sector emissions are starting to plateau as the success of wind and solar, in particular, pushes coal and gas out of the system. We've found several success stories at the national level in the power sector. For example, a number of developing countries in particular, like Namibia and Uruguay, are scaling up renewables and at the same time bolstering energy access and energy security. They're doing this through a combination of clear plans, policies, and competitive auctions. For example, Namibia held auctions which saw low-cost solar take off and grow to 1/4 of the electricity mix within a decade. So some really positive stories within the power sector that you can dive into. I'll now talk about carbon removal. So in addition to cutting emissions as quickly as possible, climate science tells us that we will also need to permanently draw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Our analysis shows that efforts to rapidly scale up technological carbon removal approaches are well off track. Less than 1 million tons of carbon dioxide is removed and permanently stored each year. That's less than 1% of the amount that we're likely to need by 2030. There is, however, some progress to report, as you can see in this incredibly busy figure. Recent years have seen a flurry of announcements and billions of dollars in private and public funding going towards technological carbon removal. For example, the US government provided $3.5 billion to build direct air capture hubs and more than tripled the tax credits for direct air capture companies. In the private sector, a new coalition of companies have also committed to buy over $1 billion worth of permanently captured and removed carbon by 2030. And there are also moves to create carbon removal policy. For example, the European Commission is working on its proposal for a carbon removal certification framework with the aim of improving the credibility of carbon removal projects. This is a promising buildup of momentum, but there is still a long way to go. And we must remember that while carbon removal is necessary to meet our climate goals, cutting emissions in the first place is the safest and the most cost-effective way to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And with that, I will hand over to Sophie.
Thanks so much, Claire. So next, we turn our attention to agriculture, forestry, and other land uses, a sector that accounted for nearly 1/5 of global greenhouse gas emissions in 2021. So protecting, restoring, and sustainably managing the world's ecosystems, especially forests, peatlands, and mangroves, can yield enormous benefits for the climate by preventing the release of their large carbon stores into the atmosphere, by protecting their ability to continue sequestering carbon, and for tropical forests in particular, by maintaining biophysical mechanisms that help cool the planet. Yet, as you can see on this slide, far too little progress has been made in safeguarding these ecosystems. From 2015 to 2022, deforestation occurred across an area roughly the size of Cameroon and emitted a total of 28 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. In 2022, specifically, deforestation increased slightly for the first time since 2016 to 5.8 million hectares. Worse still, about 60% of these permanent losses occurred in humid tropical primary forests, which are some of the world's most important ecosystems for biodiversity and carbon storage. Efforts to halt peatland degradation and dramatically reduce mangrove losses aren't faring much better. About 57 million hectares of peatlands, an area roughly the size of Kenya, are currently degrading. And although mangrove losses have slowed significantly since the late 20th century, they are once again ticking upward. And due to these ecosystems' high carbon density, the degradation or loss of even a small area can release an outsized amount of emissions. So while protecting these ecosystems must remain an urgent priority, we also need to restore 100 million hectares of forests, 15 million hectares of degraded peatlands, and 240,000 hectares of mangroves by 2030. But here too, recent efforts are falling short. Getting on track will require reforestation to occur 1.5 times faster and mangrove restoration to occur more than 10 times faster. And while global data on peatland restoration are limited, available evidence, for example, from Russia, Germany, and Indonesia, suggests that efforts are underway, but likely not yet at the pace and scale required. So although global efforts to protect and restore ecosystems remain far from promising, we are beginning to see some bright spots, particularly in efforts to virtually halt deforestation. Gabon, for example, has maintained the lowest rate of primary forest loss across the Congo Basin, losing just 1.2% of its primary forests in the last 2 decades. Such success in conserving these forests is thanks in part to a portfolio of supportive policies that have expanded protected areas, mandated more sustainable logging practices, and focused on improving traceability across supply chains. Similarly, the election of President Lula signals a dramatic shift in efforts to protect the Brazilian Amazon. Since taking office, he has taken several steps forward to halt deforestation, from revoking a law that allowed mining on protected areas and indigenous peoples' lands to rejuvenating the Amazon Fund. And we're already beginning to see measurable changes. Deforestation fell by 30% during his first 6 months in office, according to preliminary data from Brazil's National Space Agency. But conserving the world's forests, peatlands, and mangroves in part will depend on our ability to fundamentally change how we produce and consume food. Within the next 3 decades, we must grow enough food to feed nearly 10 billion people more nutritiously while lowering emissions from agricultural production and without expanding agriculture's land footprint of about 5 billion hectares. This is an absolutely enormous task and will require immediate action across supply chains. In the face of intensifying climate impacts, farmers must sustainably boost productivity, growing more food on fewer hectares to avoid clearing forests for new fields, while also safeguarding soils and freshwater resources. At the same time, these same farmers must also reduce greenhouse gas emissions from a range of agricultural practices, such as those associated with rice cultivation and livestock production. Yet global crop yields have remained quite flat in recent years, and this lack of progress now means that yield gains must accelerate by over 10-fold this decade to help curb deforestation and limit warming to 1.5 C without compromising food security. Ruminant meat productivity, or the amount of meat produced per hectare of pasture land, on the other hand, has improved steadily, but it still remains off track. And then, of course, finally, demand-side shifts will play a critical role in mitigating this sector's emission. By 2030, we need to have food loss and waste and lower consumption of beef, lamb, and goat meat in high-consuming regions to 2 servings or less per week. But while data are insufficient to assess progress made in decreasing food waste, trends in the share of food loss are now heading in the wrong direction. And efforts to accelerate these dietary shifts still remain off track and now need to occur 8 times faster. So accelerating these supply and demand side shifts can help reduce the emissions intensity of agricultural production, or the amount of greenhouse gases emitted per kilocalorie of food produced. But here too, progress remains far too slow. The emissions intensity of agricultural production has been declining steadily for decades, driven largely by steady gains in the efficiency of crop and livestock production. But to feed a growing population while delivering emissions reductions, such declines must occur 3 times faster. Fortunately, we are beginning to see some signals of change in this sector. For example, dozens of countries have pledged to increase investments in much needed agricultural innovation. Cities have committed to reducing food loss and waste through initiatives like the C40 Good Food Cities Accelerator, and major food service providers are serving more climate-friendly meals under the Cool Food Pledge. Though these recent developments offer welcome news, significantly more actions are needed to move the needle globally. And then last, but certainly not least, finance is a vital enabler of climate action across all sectors. But worryingly, most of the finance indicators we assessed are well off track. And as of this year, one is now moving in the wrong direction. While recent years have seen rises in both public and private climate finance, such growth is still well short of what's needed to help limit global warming to 1.5 C. And to be clear, but the problem is that the poorest and most vulnerable countries are getting left behind. Developing countries, excluding China, need an estimated 2.4 trillion annually in climate investment by 2030. Yet they're getting around 1/10 of this. So we need to see funds to these nations grow by an order of magnitude. Also, increasing climate finance without simultaneously phasing out investments in high emissions activities will fail to deliver the rapid emissions reductions needed this decade. Simply put, scaling up climate finance and phasing out investments in the fossil economy are 2 sides of the same coin. But to align finance with the Paris Agreement goals efforts are largely underwhelming. The ratio of global investment in low carbon energy supply to fossil fuels, for example, has now reached parity, but it needs to be a 7-to-1 ratio by the end of this decade. And efforts to expand carbon pricing systems appear stalled, with no significant increase in global emissions covered since 2021. Worse still, in 2021, total public spending on fossil fuels increased sharply after falling for several years. Fossil fuel consumption subsidies specifically reached an all-time high of over $1 trillion in 2022, with these increases driven by the war in Ukraine and resulting energy price spikes. The G7, G20, and COP have all made commitments to phase out fossil fuel subsidies, and yet things are still moving in the wrong direction. The multiple crises that the world faces in part are hampering progress in shifting investments toward climate goals. Yet in the last few years, governments have also proven that they can find the money and rewrite financial rules when a crisis is urgent enough. G20 nations spent over $14 trillion on COVID stimulus packages. The global community has committed $188 billion in aid to Ukraine, and Western companies and investors divested from Russia almost overnight in the face of regulatory action. So we absolutely can see tremendous speed and mobilize massive amounts of money when we need to. The question is, when will we see that for climate? And on that note, I will turn it back to Ani.
The amazing Sophie, and all the authors. It's just incredible. This is an incredible piece of work, and I know there's lots to process what you just heard. I just want to encourage you to look at the team has put together a fabulous data platform that allows you to dig into this data across the different indicators and across the world. So I encourage you to do that. They're posted here. I just want to say two things that to remember is that the question, if you ask yourself, what should we do about 1.5 degree? What does the world needs to do? This 42 indicators that is carefully chosen tells us what needs to happen sector by sector for us to get towards 1 point. And the second question is for us to answer how well we are doing. So I encourage you to engage on the platform, see for yourself, and see what you can find that interests you most in this. To process this very complex and a very comprehensive report that you just heard a brief summary of, I want to bring in three very, very knowledgeable people who help us think through this a little bit. I want to bring back Carlos Manuel, whom you heard from. I would like to bring in Vava Yathiriu. Vava, can we see Vava on our screen, who's a founder and executive director of Black Girls and Women's in Climate Sector, a Rhodes Scholar herself. Vava is also the Public Voices Fellow on the Climate Crisis with the Yale Program on Climate Change and Communication and the Op-Ed Project. I don't yet see Vava on the screen. I hope we are having, and then lastly, and most importantly, we have Helen Mountford joining us. Helen is the president and CEO of ClimateWorks Foundation. Helen, I think a lot of you know her, has been working for more than 30 years on the intersection of environment, economic development, climate policy. But most importantly, Helen was instrumental actually in setting up what today is the System Change Lab. So Helen, welcome. Are we having problem with Wawa?
Yes, Ani. She has a trouble connecting, so please we'll pause and we'll see if she's able to join. Her Wi-Fi.
All right, I want to go forward, and when Wawa joins, please bring her on. I'm happy to engage. So Helen, let me start with you. We are heading to COP, and what we need today, which is 15th of November, is momentum, right? So the report just shows us all the things that are not working. As I said, one indicator out of 44. But at the same time, the report also points out bright spots that gives us momentum, hope. Can you share with us and our audience, what are these bright spots and how should we process it?
Thanks very much, Ani, and congratulations to all for the fantastic report. Really, really timely and important to see this progress and also where we're off track. The reality is we actually have two truths at the moment. One, we see that we are really off track, far short of what we need on climate action. But the other is we are seeing in a lot of sectors and geographies truly spectacular progress that's surpassing what even the optimists and the experts thought was possible. So we're seeing both of these things. We're not near where we need to be in most cases, but we're also making incredible progress. And I think in the report, it really highlights this with where we're seeing some of the growth in renewable energy additions. They increased by a third in just 1 year. The EV transition is really an exciting one and important, and it's been that exponential growth that we've seen. Heat pumps witnessing double-digit growth, and what we've seen on forest loss, for example, in Brazil with the Lula presidency, really remarkable change in a short time. So these give us hope that we can do more. We've got the examples, we've got the demonstration, we can do more and build on these. I think one of the things that's really important in the report is this focus on the sort of S-curves, the transformative change we can see, where we see really exponential growth in some key sectors and technologies. Of course, even as you're very, very small, if you're starting off at the bottom of the S-curve, if you're very small, even if you double the number of EVs, it still looks pretty small. But quickly with exponential growth, it gets to something which looks like those S-curves. And that's what we're looking for. How can we push those forward? Two things I will highlight in terms of giving us hope. There are a lot of signals there which are going in the right direction, but what we need is the policy determination and action. So two things that have come in over the last 24 hours alone. Let me highlight these. One, just yesterday evening, Chinese Minister Xi Jinping and U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, released a joint statement outlining a broad range of actions where China and the U.S. are going to step up together on climate leadership. This is quite remarkable, both in terms of climate, what they're each individually committing to for their countries, but how they'll collaborate together and to support other countries on climate action. It's also remarkable in terms of addressing some of the geopolitical tensions we see now. So this is really exciting with China and the US stepping up. A lot of commitments in there, a lot to dig into on methane, on non-CO2 gases, on tripling renewable energy capacity by 2030 so as to really substitute for fossil fuel generation, subnational growth, etc. So there's a lot that they're committing to, and importantly, to come back in 2025 with their own commitments that will align with what we need for Paris and will include all greenhouse gases. So that's one which has come through. The other is in the very early hours of this morning in Europe, the European Commission adopted new mandate on methane regulations from fossil fuels. This is the first time we've seen this. It was hard fought over many years, and this is really important. So we're starting to see some of those additional policy actions we'll need to really transform the vision that we see in the state of climate action and see the exponential growth we need on solutions. But it's not enough. We do need to do more for COP. So plenty to go.
Thanks a lot, Helen. Helen, I'm going to come back to how finance can accelerate the same thing in a minute. But I'm very glad you mentioned the US-China declaration. I want all of you, if you have a chance to look at it, this is significant for two reasons. One is what US-China does together matters a lot to the mood music of the COP. And it has been frosty in recent past of these two biggest emitters. And so this is a very important step that has happened by the two envoys. As some of you might know, this is the Chinese envoy who's been there to 27. This is his last COP. So this is really a nice, positive story we're going into COP with. So thank you for raising that, Helen. And we'll come back to you. Carlos, I want to go back to you. Something you talked about in your opening remarks is we know that your passion for nature, and you've demonstrated that. And you know, you saw how nature and food systems are all interconnected, and you saw all the data that was kind of frightening, right? That slide on where we're going with food system and nature. Though, as Helen pointed out, we have seen really a lot of progress after President Lula's election. Indonesia, we've seen progress. I want you to focus on what you were talking about, leadership. What kind of leadership do we need to see on this food system nature transition?
Well, what a great question, Annie. And let me try to begin answering it, sharing an experience I had in China last week. I was in China last week looking at the Jeff portfolio, and I was blown out by the fact that I would say a third of the Chinese Jeff portfolio is run by the Ministry of Agriculture, not by the Ministry of Environment, which is why what we normally see at the Jeff, we work in 150 countries. The political and operational focal points are people from the Ministries of Environment. So what comes to the Jeff are projects that are priorities for the Ministries of Environment, not necessarily from the central government. No, I would say 99.9% of the ministers of agriculture doesn't know what the Jeff is all about. Who is Carlos Manuel Rodriguez and who are these people? And unless we understand that political challenge, we will never do progress in this food system change. What I saw in China is what we need to see in many other countries where the ministers of agriculture and environment collaborate, complement, and work together. The reality tells us that that is very, very, very different. I used to be a minister of environment in my country. Let me tell you, Annie, my biggest political challenge, not to say my biggest political headache, was the Minister of Agriculture with his traditional policies. And he believes, the Minister of Agriculture, that I, the Minister of Environment, was an adversary. Somebody who is not there to provide jobs, wealth, development. Even though in Costa Rica, rural jobs are more associated to protected areas than to agriculture because of ecotourism, but that's probably an exemption. So yes, we need an approach, particularly with multilateral organizations, where we approach governments beyond the ministries of environment, and we're heading in that direction. So I think that, Annie, we need to recognize that the institutional framework that we have created at the country level to solve all of these problems has failed big time. And I believe that the way we have organized through institution, the management of renewable and non-renewable natural resources is not helping us. Why do we continue having people trained in oil and gas managing non-renewable natural resources? And why do we continue having people on the other side, well-trained, managing renewable natural resources with different ideas? I mean, it's not a secret that ministers of energy are not good friends of the ministers of environment at the country level. And these are the teams, political teams, that we need to work in order to implement the Paris Agreement. I strongly believe that in order to do the leap forward, we need to do innovation on the institutional political sector. That means changing the setting. In the future, I don't see ministries of environment and agriculture. I will see just one agency. Why? Because Ministry of Agriculture and Environment, they work with biodiversity. One with wild biodiversity, the other with domesticated biodiversity, but they work in the same landscape, seascapes, with the same actors. So why do we keep on having two agencies with two different visions, contradictions in our aspiration of sustainability? So I want to bring to this conversation the institutional failure. As we talk of market failures, we need to bring the issue of institutional failures. Otherwise, as Annie, we may have the resources for the system change in the food sector. We can have the technology, but if we don't have the setting and the political understanding, we will never be able to impact at the scale that we need.
Carlos, can you hear me? Yes. I just very much welcome what you just said about institutional shakeup or that is needed for us to deliver the whole economy transition that is needed, which is what the main message of this work is. And I just want to point out, at least from our side at WRI, we've been really kind of thinking through and focusing on how the nature conversation, the whole nature conversation, meaning the Montreal meeting we all had, you were there, and the climate conversation, these are not separate. You cannot achieve them separately. They need to come together, the energy conversation, the climate food conversation, the agriculture conversation. So we count on our support, Carlos, on this reinventing the institutional setup we need, which I completely agree. I wanted to go ahead and we're going to run out of time, but I do want to go to two questions. One, on the finance, Alan. I mean, this has been a positive year. $1.4 trillion report said we have invested in climate, which is good, more than last year. It's now nowhere near $5.2 trillion people think we need. But the question is, not only there is a gap, which we all know there is, that a lot of these $1.4 trillion, at least the new capital, is not going to places we need it most, right? A lot of this capital is domestic capital. At the same time, we all know, as Sophie just pointed out, this transition just won't happen without the right finance. So what should we, our listeners here, think about? How do we achieve this financial outcome we need?
Thanks very much, Ani. And it is, again, one of these good news, bad news stories. We've never seen this much climate finance flowing in a single year, 1.4 trillion in 2022, but it's nowhere near enough. I think there are a couple of things that give me hope, two things that give me hope, and one where I'll say was a major missed opportunity so far, but we can seize it going forward. In terms of one, you highlighted the importance of really getting the funding flowing, particularly to developing and emerging economies, where we need to see that finance. At the moment, there's a lot of discussions and progress starting to be made on momentum to really reform the international financial institutions, including the IMF, including the World Bank, so that they can really better integrate climate across all that they do, both to help support countries on the transition to the low carbon economy we need, the zero carbon economy we need, but also to help with those countries that are vulnerable to extreme weather events, that are having their GDP just wiped out by a single storm or flood event. And that's partly led by the Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados' Bridgetown initiative that she's been championing, and a number of countries have come behind. So we're seeing some momentum there. It's starting to go through. We need more, and we need to continue to really back that to get some of the funding flowing really to the right places. The other piece that gives me hope on this is that we're seeing really rapid shifts in the private finance sector, waking up finally to the realities of climate risk and climate opportunities, and what this means in terms of making better investment choices. So in the EU, recently in California, and likely coming forward at the US federal level, we're going to be seeing mandatory disclosure of such risks. That's really exciting that we're going to see that coming forward, and it's highlighted in the report. We need to do more still, but there's a lot of voluntary action under the Glasgow Financial Alliance on net zero, over 650 financial firms and over 50 countries committed to net zero. But now we need to move to that mandatory approaches, the regulated approaches, and we're starting to see that, slow but starting. The missed opportunity really is that governments are continuing to subsidize fossil fuel production and use, and at record levels. As Sophie mentioned, this got to over $1 trillion in direct subsidies and tax breaks to fossil fuel use and production in 2022, over $1 trillion globally. That did not even include what happened in the European Union to help support households who were hit by high electricity prices. That's another $500 billion. So we've got enormous amounts going in exactly the wrong direction. This is working against all of our climate action. So this is an incredible opportunity to shift these subsidies to actually support the delivery of clean, reliable energy to all globally. And that's something that we just really have no more time to waste. We must do that and stop funding against climate action, which so many governments have been doing.
Thank you so much. You're so articulate on this, Helen. I mean, it is a conundrum, the finance part, I must say, because not only because we all know that immense gap there is. I do want to highlight last point you made on subsidy. I mean, a recent report from the World Bank showed there are $4 trillion subsidies in the world, $1 trillion+ for fossil fuel, and about $700 or $800 billion for agriculture. None of them is towards good things. All of them is actually encouraging the bad things, and which is a conundrum, right? I mean, it's not that good leaders don't know that's happening. So this money exists. The same $1 trillion could be going to encouraging renewable, right? You can subsidize renewable equally well. And the same true is in agriculture. So thank you very much to bring. It's not the money is not there. It's not actually getting invested in the right place. And I personally am very concerned it is not going to global south at the speed and scale it's needed. But thank you, Helen, very much. We have a chance for one question. I'm going to ask both of you the same question. And then we will try to get to our authors we have so many questions from our audience now. I want to get there quickly. The question I want to get back to, this COP is also different for many reasons. One reason is different is because of the GST, the global stocktake. The global stocktake is a very important part of the Paris mechanism. Paris mechanism, for my audience, I'm just repeating, I don't need to repeat this for Helen and Carlos. The Paris Agreement, the grand bargain was that every country can propose what they will do. This is the national contribution to climate. And the thing was, so that how do we know it adds up to 1.5 degree, that a few years later, in 7 years, we will do something on global stocktake to see how we are doing, to see how far we are or how close we are to the goal we set of remaining one. That's why the GST is so important. I thought the GST actually was a good document put together, made system transition at the point, something Helen and I have been talking for a long time, economy-wide transition. So I just want to ask both of you, given the GST and given the political statement on GST is about to happen, what do you think, how will that shape very critically the new NDCs that needs to happen for Belém in 2 years from now? What needs to happen to make sure those NDCs are actually aligned with the gap that the GST points out? Carlos, why don't I go to you first, and Helen, that's the same question I'm going to ask you.
Oh, thank you very much. One is definitely the future NDCs will look very similar to the actual NDCs, which is just a aspirational dream. If all public and private investment continues to support economic activities that destroy nature and contribute to climate change. But to me, there's something more important. Climate change performance at the country level is not a political issue. You go to Sao Paulo, you go to Johannesburg, you go to Mexico City, and the common citizen doesn't know what the Minister of Environment is doing in his commitment to implement the NDC. There is no political control by civil society, by common citizens in most developing countries, and I will include in developed nations as well. With the GEF, we are the biggest supporter of the implementation of Article 13 of the Paris Agreement. Article 13 has to do with transparency. So we build capacities and we help countries report on how they are doing. But paradoxically, we are not building capacities in civil society in those same countries, so civil society can use that reporting to the convention as a mechanism to do political control of the executive branch with regards to the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So as a politician myself, I see multiple gaps that we need to understand. First, we need to pinpoint, understand, and address so we can empower private sector, the political opposition, unions, the whole range of political stakeholders at the country level with the data and information so they can do political control based on reliable information, which is what countries are reporting to the convention. The day that happens, the Minister of Environment will be right next to the President of the Central Bank or the Minister of Finance in terms of giving accountability, going to Congress and account for the implementation of the NDC, or through many normal traditional check and balances that civil society has within the social contract. So I think that element is not there, and that is extremely important. Otherwise, many countries will continue to commit to unrealistic goals and targets.
Thank you so much. I'm Carlos. Making the cycle of accountability work and the role of civil society, we couldn't agree with you more. Helen, you have the last word.
Thanks very much, Ani. This global stocktake and the response to it by countries at COP28 is going to be essential for how we set the trajectory forward. Really, we do need to see, as you said, that countries take the outcomes of that and use that over the next 2 years to build their new nationally determined contributions, their new climate targets. So it's an opportunity to really be specific on what is needed to get to where we need to go in those NDCs. We're looking for, first of all, strong signals that will really show that they're stepping up targets to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, to cover all greenhouse gases across the whole economy, as you mentioned, and as Carlos mentioned, also including what's happening at the subnational level to really reflect the whole economy. And there's 4 specific targets that I think we'd like to see in that outcome to help countries get on the right track. First, to quickly and equitably scale up renewable energy, tripling it by 2030, while also phasing out fossil fuels. The two need to go together, as folks said in this call. Second, to help the at-risk countries adapt to climate change impacts and really respond to the losses and damages that they've already been sustaining from climate by improving access to finance. Third, more broadly, we really need to scale up finance, as we've already said, especially for developing countries that struggle to access it. And this includes with wealthy countries fulfilling their long overdue pledge to mobilize $100 billion annually in public and private finance by 2020. It includes doubling finance for adaptation and putting money into the new loss and damage facility that was agreed at last year's COP. And fourth, the final one, is really we need a COP28 plan that addresses how we can bolster food security and create a more resilient, sustainable food and agriculture sector, while also halting deforestation and restoring forests. That whole link to the nature agenda is absolutely essential. So those are some of the signals we're looking to see coming out of the political statement at COP, which can guide countries in what they need to do over the next couple of years. Thank you.
Helen, thank you so much. That's a fantastic list. I feel optimistic, and quite a few of them, except not yet on the reduction of fossil fuel across economy that is very much needed. I'm hoping that we are able to, that would be our surprise at Dubai, right? And that would be a fantastically positive surprise that gives us hope forward. So Helen and Carlos, thank you to both of you. I'm looking forward to seeing both of you in a few weeks in Dubai. I want to very much welcome back our fantastic authors. Emily, if you can have them back on screen. We have so many wonderful questions. I know, Kelly and team, you won't be able to answer all of them, but I hope you can actually address some of them. Hi, Sophie. And maybe we can find a way to address the others online or something like that. I really want to apologize that Wawa, we had technical difficulty with Wawa, and I hope in a future event like this we'll get Wawa back. Kelly, over to you.
Terrific, thanks. If all the authors could come on video, that would be great. We have a tremendous author team, and we have amazing questions. So thank you so much. Let me start off, Claire, with you. It says, one of the questions, 99% of the indicators are either off track and most are in the wrong direction. So the question is obvious. Is there time to course correct before the climate crisis moves into runaway mode?
Yeah, thank you. It's a really good question. Of course, there's absolutely no denying that as time keeps moving on and we don't progress fast enough, we have an increasing challenge ahead. Every year of delay means that we have to move faster. But these targets, they are based on what the science is telling us we need to do and what we can do. And the IEA just came out this year with a revised version of its roadmap for getting to net zero by 2050, showing that it's very much still possible. And in fact, IEA projections every year tend to underestimate what we're actually seeing in renewables and the surge in renewables in particular. So I think there are lots of really positive changes that show that change is possible. We also know that we can act really quickly when we need to, when we're facing a crisis. We've done it in the past. We do it when we're facing, for example, a global pandemic. So yeah, I would say it's very much a political decision now as to whether we move quickly enough. The science shows that we can do it.
Thank you so much. Speaking of political commitments, Helen, the next set of NDCs are coming in 2 years' time. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about the relationship between the sectoral transformations that are in this report, and what does this have anything to do with country level commitments and NDCs?
Thanks, Kelly. I mean, this is a fantastic report to help guide countries on where we're seeing progress, where we see some of the tipping points coming, and where they can really accelerate what they need to do in the different sectors. So as we're looking to what countries will come forward with in their NDCs, their own ones, they have to be nationally determined, but they can take what's happening in their sectors and their economy and look for where the major emissions are, where the challenges are, use this report to show where there's opportunities to really push forward, to learn from others, where there's a chance to really accelerate action. So mapping some of the opportunities, the challenges that are reflected in this report sector by sector to what they need to do in their own country is important. But it does go beyond that. It's got to be across the economy, and some of the signals here, I think, one of the questions asked about carbon pricing, for example, which actually can help with regulations, with information-based information signals that can help to drive action in a number of these sectors. We need some of these to step up further and be across the economy. So hopefully in the NDCs, people will highlight all of the sectors, what they're doing, how they're moving forward across the whole economy, and for all greenhouse gas emissions, and with links to what it means for people, how people will benefit, communities, health, jobs, and also for nature, those linkages.
Thank you so much. Sophie, I think some people could say the report, it talks about being off track year after year after year, but there's some important changes, right? And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit compared to the 2022 report, what have been changes and the main findings? Thanks.
No, of course. I think this is one of the biggest questions we get asked. And I think, so as you can tell from this presentation, throughout every sector, we provide these acceleration factors. How much faster do we need to phase out coal, reduce deforestation, et cetera? And year after year, these are largely impacted by two factors. One is what's happened in the previous year, how much faster have recent changes occurred, but also we're another year closer to 2030. So the amount of time that we have to achieve each target is dwindling. So it's a little hard to compare those numbers year on year, but what we've done this year is we've added this new analysis that looks at if we expected recent trends to continue, where would we expect an indicator to be? And what we found is that for the vast majority of indicators, there were very, very little changes in them, like less than a 5% change, which means that in general, progress is occurring too slowly. But we also use this analysis to identify what are the brightest bright spots, and then where are things far slower than they need to be. And what we found are that the most significant gains occurred in the number of countries that are mandating corporate climate risk disclosure, the scale up of electric trucks, and also the rising share of EVs in passenger car fleets. On the flip side of that, we found that some of the biggest setbacks happened in public financing for fossil fuels, in efforts to reduce deforestation, and in efforts to expand carbon pricing systems. So you can dive into the report to see a little bit more on all of that, but those are the major changes from last year's report.
Thank you so much. Joel, Sophie was talking about the pace of change. And if we're currently at something like 10% EVs, how realistic is it that we could possibly even get to 75 to 95% in 7 years? Can you talk to us a little bit about the nature of exponential or nonlinear change?
Yeah, absolutely. So with EVs, it is going to require a lot of acceleration, but we do expect them to be growing exponentially and follow an S-curve of technology adoption. That's usually what happens with technology adoption. So we're incorporating those considerations into our assessment. Passenger EVs are at the level of exponential growth where they're really hitting a breakthrough as they become cheaper than gasoline and diesel vehicles in many countries. And then in countries where they are not yet cheaper, like say the US, we are seeing big investments being made in the EV and battery supply chain, enough investments to sustain rapid growth. And you've got federal tax incentives as well. So if you're looking at like the growth rate, EVs have been growing 65% per year over the last 5 years. And between now and 2030, they only need to be growing 31% a year to reach the targets. Yes, while a lot of continued growth is needed, the rate of growth is actually looking really good. And so we do this for EVs and actually show that they're on track based on this metric. And we're looking at exponential growth throughout the report to understand it doesn't, like, say for renewables or for green hydrogen, a lot of these other technologies that could experience nonlinear growth. And it, while it's not quite on track for the other ones, it's actually showing a lot of promising momentum for other indicators as well.
Terrific. Thanks so much. Katie, a few questions came in on the role of CCS in the report, and I'm wondering if you could address that. And another question that came in that was relevant to you in terms of the opportunities for carbon removal outside of the United States. Thanks.
Yeah, great questions. So on the CCS questions, I would say first, please be sure to look at our methods report. And that's where we outline our methodology, including the risks and limitations that we see around CCS, which is in our environmental and social safeguards section there. So please take a look at that. But I think the top line that I want to say is that we see a very limited role for CCS in the power sector, and an arguably more important but also limited role for CCS in the industry sector. And it's applicable in cases like cement production, where you have emissions that are really quite hard to abate with other technologies or approaches that exist today. So in both sectors, there's a lot of other options for decarbonization. CCS is just one option that in many cases won't even make sense financially or technologically due to circumstances specific to that facility. So it's a niche technology, and I think it's gotten a lot, kind of a disproportionate amount of attention compared to its expected role, which we see as limited. I also want to say it's important to differentiate CCS from carbon dioxide removal. And we have a separate chapter on carbon dioxide removal. CCS captures emissions at a source, like a cement plant, before they go into the air. Carbon removal includes a range of technologies and approaches that pull CO2, carbon dioxide, directly out of the air. So one is a type of emissions reduction, and the other is removal or negative emissions. It's also important to note that CDR, carbon dioxide removal, includes a range of things like tree restoration, which is included in our lands chapter, to technological options like direct air capture, which we include in our technological CDR chapter. And the top line message, I think, is we need to do as much as we can on emissions reduction in the near term so that we're not relying on huge amounts of CDR later. But scientists like IPCC, IEA has made it clear that we will need to rely on some amount, and it's in our control, or it's hopefully in our control now, to reduce that as much as possible. So on the second question, I think we see a distinct role for developed countries to lead on developing these technological CDR approaches and bringing down their costs, because developed countries did the most to cause the climate crisis. At the same time, if developing countries are interested in hosting carbon removal projects, I think we need to make sure that policies and regulations at all levels are in place to ensure that these projects benefit local communities, and that the communities that would host these projects are supportive of them. And I guess I'll just mention one quick example. Recently, Kenya has expressed a lot of interest in building direct air capture plants, and they have unique circumstances, huge amounts of geothermal energy. They have basalt that can, where CO2 can be sequestered. So they have these unique circumstances that make it beneficial there. And then it's just a question of making sure that the benefits accrue to the local communities that are hosting those projects.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Let's switch gears, and Rachel, let's talk a little bit about plant-based diets. And there was a comment that there's not going to be kind of a silver bullet in terms of asking people to eat less meat. It's going to take regulation and work with corporations and stuff. Can you talk to us a little bit about what do we need in terms of some of that dietary shift?
Yes, so our primary indicator in this report focused on sustainable diets is around moderating or reducing ruminant meat consumption. So beef, lamb, and goat meat, specifically in high consuming regions such as the Americas, Europe, and Oceania. And we recognize this as a demand side indicator, but it's dependent on far more than consumer choice. So we need a combination of policies to drive these demand side shifts, such as public procurement policies that enable more plant forward menu options, or public investment into research and development and commercialization of alternative proteins, and also a realignment of subsidies that better reflect our health and sustainability objectives. And so we have to be making all of these policy shifts at the same time recognizing the affordability and availability of foods is very important as well, and that we need to increase food security at the same time that we're shifting diets. And so these are kind of part of a broader approach to shifting to more sustainable food systems, but we actually are seeing bright spots in this area. And we do highlight some of these in the report, such as the fact that a number of cities have already committed to making demand side shifts, both from the ruminant meat consumption and broader meat consumption, but also in food loss and waste as well, through initiatives such as the C40 Good Food Cities Accelerator. And we're also seeing a number of food service providers at both public and private institutions are now serving more climate-friendly meals by taking the Cool Food Pledge. And so there's a lot of hope that both from the public and private sector that these broader environmental changes are happening to support the demand side shifts we need.
Perfect, thanks. Let's take one last question and just switching from cows to electric vehicles, as one might do. I'm wondering, Stephen, if you can talk to us a little bit about electric vehicles not going to solve the world's problems in transportation. Tell us about what is needed.
Yeah, absolutely. I really quickly just want to talk a little bit about, there's this framework that is used a lot in the transportation world, which is avoid, shift, improve. And it really focuses on, it really highlights the connection between the transport sector doesn't just kind of live by itself. It's connected with land, with cities, with buildings, with power, with all these different places. So avoid is about avoiding, making choices to avoid the need for unnecessary car trips. Shift is shifting where we can to public transport, to walking, to biking, to other low carbon, zero carbon modes of transport. And then improve is really about making these improvements to car trips that are not able to be shifted. So that is electric vehicles, that is electrifying our cars, our buses, making improvements in aviation and shipping where we can use new fuels and things like that. And so it's really a portfolio of solutions, including public transport, including making it easier, safer, more accessible to get around our cities and our countries more easily, more sustainably. And so there is, as we highlight in the report, it is really kind of, there are many different aspects to transport beyond just electrifying cars that are really important to help meet our climate goals.
Perfect, thanks. And we have indicators across many of those different areas. Thank you all so much for joining. And thank you to our wonderful fireside chat, as well as Helen and Carlos, Manuel, and Ani for the discussion, and to all the author team. It was a tremendous undertaking. Hope you'll dig into the report, and most of all, hope that you bring it into the findings, whether or not you're an activist or a corporate leader or a government leader and headed to Dubai. And this is the decisive decade. We're nearing the end of 2023. We know where we need to go. We know where we're on track and off track, and we need to ramp up action now. So thank you all. And please be in touch if you have any questions. We're here to help everybody in this journey together. Thank you.